Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal when the truth of Kai's betrayal surfaced. It did not simply cause a rift in his relationship with Trina, it detonated a psychological war that rewrote the course of several lives in Port Charles. For Trina, the revelation was not just a romantic disappointment, it was a visceral rupture of loyalty, a desecration of the trust she had nurtured and fiercely protected. In her eyes, Kai had crossed a sacred line. Not only had he turned against her, but he had also weaponized information to endanger her father, Curtis, who was already teetering on the edge of ruin following the scandal involving Jacinda. Curtis had spent years rebuilding his life from hardship and self-destruction, clawing his way toward redemption and purpose. For Trina, any threat to that fragile redemption felt like a direct attack on the soul of her family. Kai had been given something precious. A place in her heart, a seat at her family's table, and access to the innermost sanctum of their private world. He repaid that generosity not with loyalty, but by confiding in Drew Kane, exposing confidential matters that left Curtis politically vulnerable and morally wounded. Trina, a woman who had grown up between the shadows of justice and betrayal, understood more than most what it meant to protect what was yours at all costs. But this time, she didn't raise her voice or collapse into grief. She turned inward, calculating, her pain sharpening into quiet vengeance. What followed was not impulsive rage. It was a controlled, surgical strike executed with chilling precision. Trina weaponized the very thing Kai had taken for granted, her love. She lured him into emotional intimacy, feigning forgiveness long enough to bait him into vulnerability. Behind the scenes, she was already planting seeds of chaos. Misdirecting his communications, feeding him misinformation, and manipulating shared contacts into isolating him without his realization. With access to the digital web of their lives, Trina fabricated a tapestry of suspicion, altered texts, strategically cropped screenshots, carefully leaked whispers into the right ears. She constructed an illusion so convincing that even those closest to Kai began to question his motives and allegiances. Kai, oblivious to the trap closing around him, walked directly into his own downfall. Every step he took seemed to backfire. His efforts to rebuild trust with Curtis were ignored, his attempts to speak with Trina deflected. He noticed his emails were suddenly being flagged. His calls went straight to voicemail. At first, he thought it was temporary, a wave of disapproval he could weather, but the silence persisted. Then came the exclusion. Invitations stopped. Meetings were rescheduled without him. His clearance for sensitive documents was revoked without explanation. Rumors began circulating, vague at first, then sharper, more personal. Words like traitor, spy, and leak started appearing next to his name in hushed conversations. He had become a pariah. But the worst betrayal came not from Trina, but from Drew. Drew had played his role masterfully. He saw in Kai not just a young man eager to do the right thing, but someone naive enough to believe that justice always aligned with charisma and political polish. Drew had no intention of saving anyone but himself. The tapes, the testimony, the emotional appeals, Drew used them all to orchestrate a full-frontal assault on Sonny Corinthos, portraying him as a manipulative force behind Natalia's tragedy. Kai's confessions were twisted into propaganda. His motivations were erased. His voice, so sincere, so earnest, was drowned beneath a tidal wave of agenda-driven soundbites. Once Drew had milked every useful drop of credibility from Kai, he dropped him without ceremony. No warning. No explanation. Drew's advisors stopped replying to Kai's inquiries. The meetings he was promised were suddenly cancelled indefinitely. The features Drew had encouraged Kai to publish under his name were reassigned. He became invisible. Worse, he became toxic. When Kai finally confronted Drew in a public hallway outside the municipal building, Drew simply gave him a look of distant professionalism, as if they had never shared a moment of truth at all. Kai's world unraveled with merciless speed. The professional community that had once welcomed him with open arms now shunned him. His name disappeared from volunteer rosters. Educational programs rescinded speaking engagements. A mentorship program quietly removed his photo from its website. Even professors who had once praised his potential began dodging his emails, citing conflicting schedules, or simply not responding at all. Emotionally, the damage was even more devastating. Trina's complete radio silence became a source of psychological torment. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply vanished. Her cold detachment spoke louder than any outburst ever could. It declared, unmistakably, that he no longer existed in her world. The silence from Curtis was even more damning. It was the silence of judgment, the quiet sentence passed by a man who had survived betrayals deeper than most and had no more patience for fools who thought themselves clever. Kai, once so full of promise, now lived in a dim apartment that seemed to shrink with every passing day. He stopped opening his blinds. He stopped returning messages, what few still came. His days were spent scrolling through social media feeds filled with images of Trina laughing with friends, Curtis speaking at events, Drew posing at podiums, all reminders that the world had moved on without him, that his relevance had been burned to ash. Desperate, Kai attempted one last effort to redeem himself. He compiled a detailed report of how he had been used, complete with timelines, email threads, and transcripts. He sent it anonymously to local reporters, hoping someone might pick up the story. No one did. It was buried under bigger headlines, and even if someone had read it, no one was willing to risk their platform on the words of a disgraced nobody. In the age of information, truth was only as valuable as the mouth it came from, and Kai's voice had been permanently muted. By the time Trina heard whispers of Kai's emotional breakdown, it was too late. He had already left town. No public statement. No goodbye. Just a single note left behind on a locked message board where they had once shared secrets as young lovers. I wanted to matter. I didn't know how to choose. I lost everything trying. But Trina did not respond. She stared at the message, her jaw tight, her heart twisted in knots. Deep down, she still carried the scars of their bond, the trust that had once been unbreakable, the laughter, the nights of shared dreams. But she also carried her father's pain, the humiliation they'd suffered, and the realization that some wounds never stop bleeding unless you cut away the infection completely. Kai's fall was not accidental. It was the result of choices, his, Drew's, Trina's, and the brutal consequence of living in a world where loyalty is currency and truth is a double-edged sword. He had entered the game hoping to be a bridge between ideals and action. But in Port Charles, there were no bridges. Only battlegrounds. And in the end, he had no side to stand on, no flag to wave, no hand to hold. Only the silence of exile, and the haunting echo of everything he used to be. Once a young man filled with fire and idealism, driven by the dream of making the world a better place, Kai now found himself stranded at the bottom of a dark and silent abyss. The fall had not been sudden, but it was absolute. Piece by piece, the scaffolding of his carefully built identity, student, reformer, ally, lover, had crumbled into dust, leaving behind only the aching echo of what might have been. He had once believed that truth was enough, that integrity could carry him through the chaos of politics, and that love could anchor him when everything else became uncertain. But now, stripped of everything, Kai realized he had gravely misjudged the cost of misaligned loyalties. His job was the first to go. The organization that had once hailed him as a promising liaison between youth and reform abruptly terminated his contract, citing reputational concerns. The polite veneer of professionalism did little to soften the sting. It was clear he had become a liability, someone who had fallen out of favor with both the progressive circles he once admired and the political elites he had naively tried to influence. No side wanted to claim him now. To the progressives, he was a sellout. To the establishment, a traitor with loose lips and dangerous ideals. He had not just burned bridges, he had unknowingly torched them from both ends. The modest apartment where he had once lived with pride, decorated with posters of social movements, shelves lined with books he once underlined in excitement, had become a silent tomb. The rooms, once filled with energy and the constant hum of purpose, were now haunted by long, heavy silences. The ticking of the clock, the creaking of floorboards, even the soft whir of the refrigerator became unbearable reminders of isolation. He stopped opening the curtains. He stopped checking his mail. The world outside moved on without him, and he let it. His phone, once buzzing with messages, interviews, collaborations, and invitations, lay cold and untouched. Friends, those he once laughed with, strategized with, and confided in, had evaporated like mist under scrutiny. Not a single one reached out. Some blocked him. Others posted cryptic statuses that clearly referenced him without naming names. The few who remained silent did so not out of loyalty, but fear. Associating with Kai was now considered social suicide. The media, ever hungry for scandal, descended with ferocity. Articles proliferated overnight, detailing Kai's betrayal, speculating on his motives, unearthing old interviews and turning them into evidence of hypocrisy. Every facial expression, every speech, every photo from rallies was twisted and dissected until even Kai couldn't remember who he had once been. The most damaging reports weren't even the ones rooted in fact, they were the ones peppered with half-truths, anonymous sources, and cruel speculation. His past activism was reframed as manipulation, his compassion repackaged as calculated performance. In the court of public opinion, nuance died quickly, and Kai was convicted without trial. The scholarship foundations and non-profits that had once proudly displayed his face on their websites began issuing statements. They expressed deep disappointment, disavowed any connection to his recent actions, and in some cases demanded repayment of previously granted stipends. It wasn't just a revocation of financial support, it was a symbolic execution. These were the institutions that had once lifted him up as the embodiment of their values. Now, they considered his name a blemish, an embarrassment to be scrubbed from history. But none of it hurt as deeply as the silence from his mother. She had been his biggest cheerleader, the woman who raised him alone, who stayed up late proofreading his essays, who watched every speech he ever gave with tears in her eyes and pride swelling in her chest. She had once told him, "You are the proof that our family rises." But now, in his greatest hour of need, her phone line was cold. Her messages stopped coming. She didn't write. She didn't ask if he was eating, if he was okay, if he needed help. Nothing. Her silence was not born of anger, it was worse than that. It was distance. Disappointment. It was the unspoken, piercing message that he was no longer someone she recognized. And that quiet, unyielding withdrawal wounded him more than any media headline, any professional rejection, or any betrayal by friends. Alone, Kai wandered the days like a ghost inside his own life, floating between memories and regret. Sometimes he replayed conversations with Trina in his mind, her laugh, her eyes when she spoke of justice, the way she once looked at him like he could change the world. Now, he couldn't even change himself. The future he had imagined was gone. There were no second chances. No redemption arcs. Just the cold, hard truth that he had been used, discarded, and erased. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest like an invisible hand, suffocating and unrelenting. In the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The eyes staring back were hollow, aged beyond their years. The idealist was gone, replaced by a man stripped of purpose, belief, and connection. The world had no use for him now, not as a spokesman, not as a symbol, not even as a cautionary tale. He was simply forgotten, a footnote in a city that moved too fast to mourn the fallen. And yet, even in that bleakness, some part of Kai still hoped, for what, he didn't know. Forgiveness? Understanding? Maybe not from the world, but from the person he used to be. From the boy who had once believed he could be both good and brave, who had dreamed of being a force of change. That boy was gone, but perhaps, buried beneath the wreckage, a flicker of him still remained. Waiting. Watching. Wondering if, one day, it might be safe to try again. Curtis had seen betrayal before. He had stood at the crossroads of trust and treachery, had been burned by friends, lovers, even family. But nothing had quite prepared him for the storm Kai's actions unleashed, not just for the personal fallout, but for the collateral damage it left in its wake. At first, Curtis had responded with instinctive anger. He had trusted the young man, welcomed him into his circle, allowed him into the protective shell he had built around Trina and himself after years of emotional wounds. But Kai had not just crossed a boundary, he had shattered something fragile. Something sacred. Yet even in his fury, Curtis hadn't imagined the devastation that would follow. He had thought, perhaps naively, that Kai would face consequences, certainly, public censure, personal reckoning, but not total collapse. He had underestimated the magnitude of the machinery now bearing down on the young man. Kai hadn't just lost credibility, he had been erased. And though Curtis didn't voice it aloud, part of him wondered, quietly, painfully, if he had lit the first match in a fire that consumed more than it should have. But duty had dictated his choice. Loyalty to his daughter. Loyalty to the truth. Loyalty to the life he had fought tooth and nail to rebuild. And when the moment came, he had chosen his family, because in a world this unforgiving, to hesitate was to lose everything. For Trina, the weight of victory came with its own cost. She had played her part with precision and steel, taking back control of the narrative, defending her father's honor, and silencing the voice that had betrayed her trust. The world saw her as fierce, unstoppable, principled, a young woman who had stood up and refused to be made a fool of. But beneath that armor lay a wound that no applause could heal. Because she had not simply defeated a traitor. She had destroyed a man she once loved with all the hope of someone who still believed love could change anything. Kai had been her sunrise, bright, eager, full of promise. She remembered his nervous laugh, the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke about things he believed in, the way his voice cracked with sincerity when he talked about justice and hope. She had believed in him. Believed that together they could navigate the storm, that their love was stronger than politics, than lies, than ambition. But now, when she closed her eyes and searched for that memory, all she saw was a stranger, lost and staggering through the wreckage of his own choices. She had delivered justice. She had protected her father. She had upheld her values. But in doing so, she had carved something out of herself, a piece of heart that would never quite grow back. Love and war had collided inside her, and though she had emerged the victor, it had left her standing over the ruins of something once beautiful. She did not regret what she had done. But she mourned what she had lost. Kai, for his part, had moved beyond mourning. Mourning required hope, and hope had long since drained from him. His days were now a blur, long hours of silence, broken only by the occasional knock from a landlord or the flicker of a muted television. His apartment, once full of books and vision boards, now felt like a mausoleum of ambition. The posters on the wall, once inspirational quotes and images of great thinkers, had curled at the edges from neglect. Dust collected in corners he no longer bothered to clean. The refrigerator hummed softly, mocking the emptiness within it. There were days he didn't eat. Nights he didn't sleep. Time folded into itself until he could no longer tell Monday from Thursday. Friends had vanished first. The silence from Trina and Curtis he expected, but it was the absence of peers, mentors, and collaborators that hollowed him out. People he had organized with, fought for, defended, none came to his aid. They didn't ask for explanations. They didn't offer a second chance. The moment the narrative shifted, they abandoned him, afraid of guilt by association. Even the ones who privately expressed sympathy did so with distance, with disclaimers, with an unwillingness to stand beside a name now synonymous with scandal. Then came the public dismantling. News segments aired discussing the Kai Taylor incident, dissecting his motives with surgical cruelty. Some painted him as a manipulative opportunist, others as a misguided child playing a man's game. Editorials demanded accountability. Talk shows turned him into punchlines. And worse, digital mobs. Relentless, faceless, descended. Old tweets were dug up, emails leaked, every photo scrutinized. Speculation became gospel. And truth, his truth, was no longer welcome. His former sponsors issued press releases. One by one, scholarships were revoked, fellowships rescinded. Their letters were cold and impersonal, each line calculated to distance themselves from a lapse in judgment. He had once stood on their stages, shaking hands with board members and giving speeches about equity. Now he was erased from their websites like he had never existed. And then there was his mother. The silence from her was not just absence, it was annihilation. She had raised him alone, cleaned offices at night so he could attend university. She had sacrificed everything to give him a chance. And Kai had always felt her belief in him like a lighthouse in the storm. But now, there were no calls. No messages. Just silence. Perhaps she was ashamed. Perhaps she couldn't bear to watch her son be torn apart. But the result was the same, Kai was utterly, undeniably alone. Curtis, watching from afar, said nothing. He didn't reach out. He didn't offer solace. He knew that to do so would blur the lines he had drawn. And Trina, for all the tears she shed in secret, could not allow herself to forget the betrayal. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The world had taught them all that choices have consequences, and mercy, once broken, was hard to restore. Drew, meanwhile, thrived. For now. He wore his suits, gave his speeches, reaped the political capital earned by Kai's fall. He had weaponized trust, manipulated a young man's ideals, and walked away clean. But the shadows behind his smile were growing. Whispers circled in corridors. Documents sat in encrypted files waiting to be leaked. He knew it couldn't last forever. But he was a master at delay. And delay was power.